All right, we are recording. We're good to go.
I appreciate that. Thanks again, Scott. Hey, first off, again, good afternoon. Welcome back, everyone. Really appreciate your time. We're going to spend the next 50 or so minutes going through intrusion prevention. The agenda is pretty comprehensive. There's a lot of things to talk about, but I prefer to demo than talk. So I do have a handful of slides to go through just to explain some things, but just like the previous sessions, it's going to be driven from a demo perspective. So the agenda is pretty much anything and everything intrusion prevention. We'll talk about the different base layers that we get from Cisco when it comes to the Firepower Intrusion Policy. Essentially, there's 5, but there's 3 that we work with, the balance. Then the other 2 are security over connectivity, and then connectivity over security. Then we'll talk about rule actions, some of the different rule actions we can have to our intrusion rules. Firepower recommendations, this kind of goes hand in hand with 2 things. One is snort rule updates and network discovery. And I'll talk about some of the things you may or may not be aware, but typically most customers are not aware of some of the advanced settings under Firepower recommendations. We'll talk about this. Tuning IPS rules, I've demonstrated that in the last recording. We'll cover that again. I will pull up the network analysis policies just to show you the difference between an intrusion policy and network analysis, but yet some similarities. We'll talk about some of the advanced intrusion policy features like shared IPS policy layers. And we'll basically understand some of the things that I've seen many customers do over the years, and we'll be more than happy to share between the panelists. We've got plenty of IPS, whether it's SourceFire or Cisco, experience, share with you guys some of what we've seen out in the field from other customers as well. So what is an IPS policy? Well, really a policy is made up of about 35,000 snort rules. That number is growing on an ongoing basis. And when we get this from Cisco, some of these rules are set to be enabled, and some are set to be disabled. And if they are enabled, one of 2 rule action. One is to generate an event. The other state is to drop the packet and generate an event. And obviously, if the rule is disabled, then it does not generate any type of intrusion event if a packet matches a rule that is disabled. So you never typically want to turn on all the IPS rules for many, many reasons. Number one is it's going to hinder performance dramatically, and the likelihood of break-in applications that may match the traffic may match some of the rules is probable, so you may be potentially breaking applications. And not to mention, why have the sensors perform needless processing when the rules for, say, NT4.0 are not required because we're not running Windows NT4.0. And within an access control policy, you can have several intrusion policies mapped within your access control, one on a per access control policy rule. So if you have a rule that says allow or interactive block as a rule action, then you can then have a intrusion policy for that specific rule. Obviously, if the rule action is set to block, then there's no inspection because we're blocking that traffic from a firewall perspective. So we'll go through and review the different IPS policies. The number one question that I like to ask customers when we talk about a base layer is which one do you pick and why would you pick, whether you're looking at the balanced, whether you're looking at security over connectivity or connectivity over security, which one do you pick and why? And here's the short excerpt from snort.org. When we look at the base policies, essentially, connectivity of security looks at a couple of factors to determine which rules are enabled. So we'll look at the current year from a vulnerability perspective or current timestamp, and we go -2 years in time. We look at vulnerabilities that are no more than 2 years old and that have a common vulnerability score of 10. And only the rules that would be protecting exploit of those vulnerabilities are enabled. So we certainly have a lot fewer rules. We're going to be prone to a lot less, fewer false positives, and you get better performance. So that's why we call it connectivity over security. It's got quite a small subset of rules that are enabled. Or again, only the rules that are looking for vulnerabilities that have a CVS score of 10. When we look at the balanced security and connectivity, it is just like connectivity over security in the fact that it is current -2 years for looking at how old the vulnerability exists. However, it does look at vulnerabilities that do have a score of 9 and 10. But as well as it looks at some of the rules in the following categories: malware, command and control, exploit kit, SQL injection, and a blacklist, and turns some of those rules on. So it is not only going back and looking at CVS's of a score of 9 and 10, but it's turning on additional rule for enhanced and better security. And then the last one, security over connectivity, it is current -3 years when we look at vulnerabilities that exist, and it also looks at common vulnerability scores that are not only 9 and 10, but it also looks at scores from 8 as well. So we're looking at 8, 9, and 10. And then we're looking at 3 years, and it also adds rules from the app detect category. So that's why when we look at security over connectivity, it's got a lot more rules to turn on, because the criteria to turn on and enable the rules is a broader from a CVS or a vulnerability score and from a time period. So we're obviously going to have a lot more. So the short question is, well, which one makes more sense for your environment? And typically what you want to look and identify is, well, what are the vulnerabilities? And more importantly, what is our patch management process, right? If your patch management is spot on, well, I'm not sure if you need to go 3 years back in time to turn on rules for vulnerabilities that have been around for 3 years, let alone 2 years, but every environment is different. So again, just putting this out there so you guys have the information. I've got really one more slide to go through, which is this one. This is just to really understand a snort rule construct. Every snort rule is made up of 2 components, the rule header. Think of this as the 5-tuple. You've got your action, you've got your protocol, then you've got your source IP, source port, then you've got your destination IP, destination port. And if you look at the snort rules and the snort rule writers, they won't actually type an IP address there. They're going to use what we refer to as a variable. So external net, home net, both are variables, and a value is assigned to those variables. So as an example, if you look at the default variable set, which comes with Firepower, pretty much everything has an any IP address value. So if you don't modify your default variable set, essentially I'm saying alert TCP any over the following 140 plus ports going towards my any IP address over any port. So what's going to happen if it matches the header, then you're forcing snort to go look at the body and to identify if the packet matches the rule. And everything in the rule needs to match in order for the rule to trigger. So if it's not going to match on the body, then you force snort to go look at the body needlessly. So what you want to do is give values to your variables, right? So external net would be anything that's not internal to your network, and your home net it really is the network or the segments that are behind your firewall. So if your firewall is sitting on the internet edge, or if your IPS is sitting on your internet edge, you can use RFC 1918 as your home net, and anything that's not RFC 1918 as your external net. But if this is sitting in a data center, and your data center is a .10, and on the other side of your sensor is a .20, well, then the .20 is really your external net, and your .10 is your home net. Having said that, I would still say the home net is .10, and my external is anything but my .10 network. So again, this is just allows you to tune your policies and make Snort a bit more effective in handling traffic, instead of forcing it to look at all the rules that are enabled due to not having values to your variable sets. So as always, I'd like to show you the topology that I work with. So this is my home lab. I've got a variety of different devices that are running either Linux or Windows with a domain controller. Some of these have endpoints. Some of these have the umbrella roaming client. Traffic, if I'm not wireless, will go through an ASA to the internet. Today, I'm actually not going through that ASA, but I do have a virtual next-gen IPS that's being managed by my FMC, and I am running 6.2.3 for my FMC. And these are the components that I'm actually using in today's environment. Actually, what's not shown here is I do have Kali running as well. Now, before I jump into the GUI and to start demoing, I am open to ideas. Anything you guys think would be an interesting topic, send me an email, and any and all suggestions are considered. The next session will be the 20th of July. The invite has not been created, but this will be created very early next week and will be going out. And again, if you do have ideas of what you would like to see, please let me know. Let your CSC know, and we'll make sure we carve something out for you. Cool beans. Let's go ahead and jump in the GUI. With that, let me close this notepad. Now that is the longest notepad ever. Let me just come back here and do an X. And let's save this. Perfect. So let's go in and dive into my policies. And I'm going to go to my intrusion policy right away. And I'm going to open this up in a new tab. And let's go to that tab. And you're going to see I've got a few intrusion policies. I'm going to go in and create a new intrusion policy. And I'm going to call this my Friday Firepower Hour Demo IPS policy. And here are the different base policies that come from Cisco. No rules active is typically not used. Once upon a time, this was under the advanced tab of your access control policy when we let a few packets in to determine the actual application that we're trying to detect. Depending on the version of Firepower, this still might be used, but that's been changed to use balanced. There's maximum detection, which again is more of an experimental base layer. I would not encourage anyone to use this. I would always encourage you to use either security over connectivity over security, and balance, with balance being typically the recommended and preferred, but always understand which the implications of which of these policies you would deploy. Notice that I could also use a user-created policy as my base layer. I'm going to come back and talk about this when it comes to best practices. I've worked with several customers that have a process of how they deploy policies. So we're going to go through and talk about this. But for now, I'm going to pick balanced. And if I want this policy to drop packets, I leave this checkbox to drop when in line. If I want my IPS policy to be in learning mode, then I can clear this checkbox, and now this policy is simply in audit mode or in IDS mode. So even though my firewall's in layer 3, I'm blocking security intelligence, layer 3, layer 4, I'm blocking applications, but my IPS needs to be in a passive deployment, clear that checkbox, and then I'm good to go. I'm going to leave mine checked. I want to drop one in line. I'm going to create and edit this policy. This will take me about 15 seconds to load up. While it's loading up, let me show you the actual effect of having that checkbox cleared. So if I go look at my intrusion events, and let me go to that tab while my intrusion policy loads. I'm going to show you what the intrusion events would look like when you do have a policy that is set to not drop when in line. So the inline result is 100% dependent on whether that checkbox is there or not. So once this policy loads, if that checkbox here is cleared, drop when in line is cleared, so that implies this policy will be in audit mode or IDS mode. So this is where, if I hover over this arrow, because it's grayed out, I know that this implies the policy is do not drop when in line, so therefore it would have dropped had that checkbox been enabled. So this is a great way from day one when I want to deploy my IPS policy, but I really don't know what to expect, don't want to break anything, clear the checkbox, and now the policy is in audit mode. So now I can come in and do my forensics and then start tuning rules out. And then once you've tuned to reduce the false positives, you can go in and check the box, deploy, and now you are in blocking mode. And when I'm seeing dropped, that implies that the policy was leveraging the drop when in line checkbox. And obviously, if there's no arrows, that means the rule that triggered was set to generate an event but not drop the packet. So I'm being notified, but nothing is being blocked. So let's go back to this policy. So again, I could now change the policy at any given time. This is more of a policy summary of everything that is aggregate. And really what makes up my intrusion policy, there's a lot of layers within this policy. So let's expand the policy layers and really understand what we're talking about here. So this is the base layer. If I expand this, there's the rules, and there's a preprocessor. I'll come back and talk about this. So all the rules that come from Cisco, you cannot edit these. So if I highlight this, I can show details, but really all the rule actions, these are grayed out from me. So the base layer is not something you can modify. However, when you look at right above this, there's my changes, and you also have rules there. And really, these rules all have settings that come from the below layer. And here's an example that this is coming from a below layer, right? So this tells me that rule is enabled at a lower level, which is under my base layer, and it's got something there. But notice I could check this off, and now I could change the rule state, which would then override whatever comes from the base layer. So if you think about how this works from a hierarchy perspective, these rules here at the bottom or base layer, I've got 9,380. Well, that's right now. Tomorrow that may change, or next week that may change when we download the up-to-date SNOT rule updates, so that number may change. But right now I've got 9,380. So if I go to my rules and I pick one and I say, well, this rule, I want this to drop and generate an event. So when I go back and look at the policy layers, it's actually going to show me under the base layer you've got X number of rules. However, in your layer you're going to have X number of rules, and the aggregate is right here. So this is the combination of your user layer and the built-in layers. So again, the built-in layers, I cannot modify these, can't change anything. I can view it. So this comes from Cisco, and it's based on the slide that I showed earlier, based on, well, number one, what base layer you're picking, whether it's the connectivity, security, or the balance, and then these are predefined for you. So if I typically, what I like to do is I'll come to my changes, and let's say this is for my data center. So I can come in here and say this is data center, and I can say, well, this is data center HQ or Dallas or whatever the location of my data center is. So I can give this a name. So as soon as I give this a name, I can click somewhere else, come back, and notice actually the name here changes to Data Center Dallas. So now this is actually my intrusion policy is going to be made up of rules that come from Cisco as well as rules that come from my own layer, which in fact would override if there's a conflict between the base layer from Cisco and the layer that I created. So if I go look at the rules, now I could come in here and I could say I'm going to look at the malware command and control. When I check this, I don't have anything configured. If I go look at the balance, security, and connectivity, and I'm going to keep the malware command and control, notice that these all have settings. This one is set to block. This one is set to, well, actually this one is disabled, this one is disabled, this one's disabled. So you can actually start seeing some are set to drop the packet, some are disabled, and maybe some might be set to generate only an event. But the point is, these are settings that come from the base layer. Let me show you what I mean when I say I can override this. So if I go to my layers and I say these are the malware command and control, there's 4,435 snort rules. If I check the top box, now I've got 4,435 snort rules that are selected. If I come in here and I say, well, I want all these rules to be disabled, now even though they're enabled under the base layer, which is the balanced security and connectivity, this would override the settings because the policy is processed top-down from all the layers. So the higher the layer, the higher the priority. If I want all these rules to drop the packet, I can then just click on the drop and generate an event. And same thing if I only want to be notified but not block the traffic or drop the packet, then I would pick generate an event. So just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to say drop and generate an event. So you're going to see the snort rule icon. It's going to give me a red X. So let me click on the OK. So even though under the base layer, when I'm looking at malware, notice that they're all pink. Well, that implies that the setting is coming from an above layer. So visually, I know where the configuration for that snort rule is. When you're looking at your rules under your policy info, this is just an aggregate of all your layers combined together. And when, pick any snort rule. If you pick a snort rule, and I'm going to say this is rule 23,615 as an example, let's go look at the base layer and look at the rule action for that one. So it's actually saying block, and the fact that I said block, if this rule state changes in 6 months from now because of the policy layer changes, for whatever reason, the CVE is now more than 2 years old, or whatever the metric is used at changes the state of that rule, the fact that my rule has it set to drop, that will always take priority. And essentially now when I go look at my rules, it's going to be an aggregate of both layers, and again, it's just showing me everything. So let's go look at the policy info, Now I've got, X number of rules, and this is the aggregate. If you wanted to view this on a per layer basis, I can click on policy layers, and now I can actually view that this number hasn't changed. However, the number under my user layer has changed. So now I've got 4,435 rules in conjunction with whatever rules that were not already configured under my base layer. It gives me a net result of 10,800 rules now that are dropped in the packet for a total of 10,875 rules in total, right? I want to come back and talk about what this global rule threshold is. So this is a preprocessor. When I click on my balance, security, and connectivity, these are the predefined preprocessors. Now, anyone who's been working with SourceFire for some time or Firepower for some time, this used to be pretty comprehensive. All your engines, the packet inspection engines were listed here. In 5.4, they got removed and a network analysis policy was created, and then most of these were actually put in a separate policy. Some of these packet engines were put in the advanced tab of the access control policy, and only a handful stayed behind. And notice that only the global rule threshold is enabled, and I could actually view it. So basically, if it's listed here, it's because it is enabled. If I go to my layer and there is a sensitive data, there is SNMP or syslog alerting. Let's say I want to go in and enable sensitive data. I'm not saying to do this, but I could just for demonstration purposes. Notice that now it's listed here under my own layer. So when I look at the aggregate of both layers, I can actually see that under the advanced settings, which is really the preprocessor settings, I've got sensitive data. And when the aggregate from both layers, I've got the global rule thresholding, and I've got sensitive data. So let's say I really don't want the global rule thresholding, meaning that I don't want to have 60-second interval between the rule, generate as many events as you want. I could say disable this, and because it's disabled, when I go look at the aggregate of both layers, notice that I'm saying I'm turning off the global rule thresholding. So now the actual net result is only sensitive data for my policy. So this is a great way for you guys to understand this. Let me show you a couple more things. When I go look at my layer, I could say allow this layer to be used by other policies. So now I can go in and set this up to my likings. I can come in here and I could invest all the time to go through my intrusion file, my intrusion policy accordion, and sort based on the categories for rules, based on Microsoft vulnerabilities, based on platform specific or even classifications. And once I've got all the rules that I want to be enabled or configured, at that point in time, I could come here to this layer and say, allow this layer to be used by other policies. When I go create a new intrusion policy, one option is to actually add a layer. So when I'm adding a layer, I could add a shared layer. So now that I've shared it, I could make this available in another intrusion policy. And this could, in fact, sit on top of your built-in layers, right? So I've been talking a lot about some of the things we can do. I'm going to move on to Firepower recommendations next. So under Firepower recommendations, I have not enabled this. So I can go in and say generate the recommendations. So this allows me to review them. Or I could say generate and actually use them. Before I do that, this is coming from my network discovery. So in a previous recording, I talked about how to set up a network discovery policy, and this allows me to view the different IPs on the network, the different operating systems that are mapped to these IPs, different open ports, and so on. So with that, there's something called the Vulnerability Database, or the VDB, that is downloaded, and you typically have to update that. If you haven't or don't know what a VDB is, please look into that, because that has your application detectors and has a list of the vulnerabilities that are applied to your host profile. So again, this is a Windows 7. These are all the open ports. If I scroll down to the very bottom, there is a list of vulnerabilities. And again, this is all passively done. So this is probably not a true accurate, but it is a great starting point. So this is assuming I'm not fully patched, and it's up to me to import some vulnerability scanning output in order to finally tune this, but it's a great starting point. So the VDB allows me to have newer vulnerabilities mapped to different applications and operating systems. So the point is, as you build your network discovery, as we discover the endpoints and exactly what the operating systems are and what's running and what are the open ports, and then we can map vulnerabilities to them, now it's just a matter of leveraging this information under my Firepower recommendations. So if we go back and look at the Firepower recommendations, there's an advanced settings. So if I leave this blank, if I leave this network section blank, I'm implying go check the entire host profile. So that's great if I've got a firewall running IPS instead of my Internet Edge, and it's going to protect anything and everything behind it. But if this is for a firewall at a branch office, and the branch office is only running the 192.168.133 network, then it makes no sense to leave this completely blank, because let's assume for a minute that I have, I don't know, 10,000 IP addresses, and the 133 branch is a /24, so I've got 250 plus IPs. Why would I want to turn on intrusion rules for vulnerabilities that exist in other IPs that may not be found for that branch site? So that could be a good justification for having a separate intrusion policy for that branch office. And the same thing, if this next-gen IPS was deployed in my data center, and behind the data center I'm running the .111 network, well, why would I want to leave this blank? Right? Why not make this specific? And by the way, I can put a comma, and I could put multiple subnets if need be, right? And now I can go in and generate and use recommendations or generate recommendations. The other thing I'm going to call out is, notice that there's rule threshold, right? The rule overhead threshold. And by default, it's set to medium. Well, what does this mean, right? What does this bar mean? So if I go look at my rules, so I'm going to navigate away from here. I'm going to go look at my rules. Under the rule accordion, right, I'm going to X this out. I want to see all my rules. I'm going to go under my rule configuration, and I'm actually looking at the, rule content, and I'm looking based on rule overhead. So every snort rule writer will actually have to define a rule overhead, meaning what's the overhead on snort to run and run a packet against the snort rule. So when you check this and highlight it and then go down to show details, here is that rule overhead. It's green. It's low. If I look at a medium snort rule overhead, that should come back. Let me hide details here and pick another one that's a medium, and the color should be kind of a not quite green, not quite yellow, kind of in between, like an olive color. If I go to high and I pick this, now this should be a orangey color. And then lastly, there's very high, which essentially should be red. So let me pick a different snort rule. That's a high rule overhead, and show details, and that is red, right? So it's CPU intensive, snort CPU intensive to inspect packets against this rule. Now, I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. I don't know if anyone noticed this or not. When I click on high, I've got 4,151 rules that have this rule overhead. When I clicked on the very high, that changed to over 20,000. Let's go back to the Firepower recommendations and notice that these are the settings that we have to work with. And you can see the color coding matches that of the snort rule, right? So now I could turn on the recommendation based on this. But just know that before you start toggling this bar, that there can be a performance implication based on the number of rules that you will be turning on for this intrusion policy. So understanding the load on your sensor is a good start. So I'm going to leave this at medium for demonstration purposes. I'm going to leave this under the 133/24. I'm going to generate and use the recommendations, and we're going to look at where this lies in the intrusion policy. How are we doing on questions so far, guys? Any questions coming up?
All good so far.
Cool beans. Thanks, Ryan. So I can come in here and I can close this tab. And I'm going to go ahead and close this tab as well. Fewer tabs makes it easier for me to navigate. Now, while this is running, let me come here, go to my policies, go to my access control, and I'm going to edit an existing policy. I'm going to edit my DMZ access control policy. So earlier when we talked about I could then map an intrusion policy to an access control policy rule that has an allow or interactive block. So when I go in to create a new rule, regardless of the different conditions that are required, whether it's the network, whether it's a user, whether it's an application, what I'm going to focus on is this rule action, right? So when I say allow this, I can now come to my inspection, and I could select an intrusion policy. And notice that we do have a variable set. Again, you don't want to use the default because that's set to any unless you've modified it. So I've created this specific for my DMZ based on IP addressing. Interactive block would allow me to perform the same inspection because an interactive block or interactive block with a reset implies that we're blocking the web page. This is done for HTTP traffic or web surfing. So we're going to block the web page, but the user gets a prompt to click on the continue. When he does, it becomes an allow. So because it's an allow, we can perform inspection. But if we do a trust, well, if you trust it, well, you can't really inspect it because the point is I trust it. So this becomes grayed out. And if you say, well, monitor, well, this is just a logging only. It turns on logging for me automatically, and I can't turn that off. And if I say block, well, again, a block, no traffic is going to get through, so no sense inspecting it. So that IPS policy needs to be mapped to an allow or interactive block rule action. So let me go back to my intrusion policy, and let's go back to my policy layers. And notice actually it added Firepower recommendations, and all I have is rules. And from here, just like the base layer, I cannot edit anything. This is read only. And these would then supersede the balanced security and connectivity base layer, just like my layer, my user layer, would then supersede both Firepower recommendations and the base layer that I pick. So when I click on the policy layers, again, built-in layers is now an aggregate of whatever layer I picked that came from Cisco, the recommendations, but I still have my layer that sits on top. So the one thing to understand is snort rules are coming out typically a couple times a week, maybe 10 times a month on average. Let's say this is a sensitive network and we don't want to download snort rule updates on this specific policy. If you click on the base layer, notice that when new rules are downloaded, this is being updated. So if you clear this checkbox, now it becomes static. No new updates will come down. And if you're wondering, well, what new updates and what are the changes, you can actually view that by going under your rules and by clicking on my rule update. And there's a timestamp that I can view it from here. So if you import your own rules, which you can, if you want to pick any one, I'll just pick this one here. I can click on the new or change. So I'm going to clear the very high first, because this is a search bar that aggregates everything. And I say, well, show me all the new rules that came out for March 22nd, 2017. Click on the new, and it comes back, and I got 24, and I could see what the rules state is, and I could see what the recommendations are that came from above, right? And the same thing, if I wanted to view all the changes, I would come back and click on change, and with that, it comes back, and there are 6 rules that have changed. So now I can actually view exactly what's going on from a changes perspective with Snort rules. So let me come back to this, and I do want to get the updates. I'm going to go to my layer, and I want this to be used by other policies. I can go to my policy info, and I could commit my changes or discard my changes. So let me go in and commit this. I'm going to say this is Friday Firepower Hour Demo Policy. Okay. And by the way, there's about 3 different ways you can get to anything in the IPS policy or the intrusion policy. Once you get familiar, I can click on any one of these links here, and all this does, it takes me to the rules with whatever rule action, it's going to have that pre-populated in a search bar, and now I could leverage that as just a query to view and display these rules, right? So that's one way of doing that. While this is running, I'm going to come back here, and under the Advanced tab, there is the Network Analysis and Intrusion Policies. So again, there is an intrusion policy here. There is a network analysis policy. I'm going to go ahead and edit so we can get access to my network analysis policies. Clicking on this opens up another tab. And all the preprocessors, or most of them anyways, that were behind the in the intrusion policy in 5.3, well, in 5.4, that's changed. So when I go create a policy, notice that I'm going to have similar options from a base layer. So I can pick the balance, connectivity, or security for connectivity. And once you pick that, I'm going to give this a name, the Friday Firepower Hour NAP policy, create an edit, and it's the same thing. You're going to see all the preprocessors that are enabled. I'll list it underneath my policy name, and that does not mean that that's the only preprocessor in that list. It only implies these are the only ones that are enabled. If I click on settings, under the application layer, you can actually see that SIP, IMAP, POP, all those 3 are disabled. You can turn that on if you wanted to. A couple of SCADA preprocessors are disabled. If you want to turn them on, you certainly can. And you've got actually some for port scans. So if you actually want to detect port scan, you can by turning on that preprocessor, right? So this is, when you turn that on, notice that it gets added right here. By clicking on it, you can actually see the different scan types, and I can go in and tune this if I wanted to. But the point is, these are just typical engines that the packet and the traffic runs through these before they actually get to the intrusion rules. So this is the sequence. But again, I wanted to call this out to show you where all the preprocessors lie. And I could be real granular in how I want to set up this policy, meaning when I come back here and look at my NAP policy, notice that I can go in and create a custom rule that says I want to use this specific network analysis policy for a specific segment for specific networks. So for this specific network, my DMZ, add this to the destination, this is the network analysis policy I want to use for that, here is that Friday Firepower NAP policy, add that, and now anything going to the DMZ, that's the preprocessor or the engine, so I could have something that is maybe more aggressive or less aggressive or can be tuned for that specific segment. All what we're doing with this is providing more granular control to snort over the traffic depending on where the sensor placement is. So now let me come back to this intrusion policies, and here it is. It's done. It's the Friday Firepower Hour demo IPS policy. I'm going to create a new policy. I'm going to call this the demo 2, so my Friday Firepower Hour dash demo 2 dash IPS policy. So notice the base layer now, instead of picking balance, I can come in here and say, well, I want to use the demo IPS policy as my base layer. I'm going to create and edit this policy. So I've seen several customers that do this. They get a policy and they turn on in their layer, the one that I call data center-Dallas, you turn on the rules that you need, and then you make that as a base layer that you can then use this in different policies. If you think about the scalability that this provides, I can now go to my first intrusion policy, modify that layer, and anywhere and everywhere that that layer is used, those changes are dynamically replicated because it's pointing to the same source. So I'm going to wait and let this expand. And if I go to my base layers, and here it is. Let's go to the rules here. And again, it's grayed out. I can't modify this. The only place to modify these rules would be under my Friday Firepower Hour demo without the 2 IPS policy, which is under my layer. So this is a great way for me to build a policy which is basically inheriting a base layer from Cisco in conjunction with my own changes, and now I could leverage that as a base layer for other intrusion policies. So the only thing maybe I want to do is maybe I've got 3 branch sites, 4 branch sites, and I want to turn on all the malware intrusion rules, command and control intrusion rules, but I want to have a granular firepower recommendations. So now I could have my base layer be consistent, and I could go to my recommendations, and I could expand the advanced setting and say, well, this is my branch office, which is the 192.168.10.0/24. And let's do the recommendations for that site specific. And now I don't have to go in and modify all the different categories for the rules because it is under my base layer. So if you think about the time saving, so this allows me to be granular in my IPS policies because I've got a different policy and I'm leveraging the recommendations. However, my rules are consistent across all my sites, if that makes sense. And I'm going to wait for this to go through. And we've got about 7 minutes left, guys. How are we doing on Q&A?
All good.
Cool stuff. While that's running, I'm going to come back here, and I'm actually going to go in and discard the changes for this NAP policy. And I'm going to come back here and give this about 10 more seconds. This should be done. Now that I said 10, it might take 20. And I'm going to go ahead and cancel this. There we go. Right, so now this one from Firepower Recommendations, let me actually click on that layer. We can actually see it. 6,314 rules that are set to drop. It turned off 12,000 plus rules. However, if I click on those rules that are disabled, I'm going to pick this rule, 30,254. Let me go to my layer. It's disabled, right? 30,254. I'll go to my layer, clear this. I'm looking for rule 30,254. And it's disabled. This is coming from a below layer. I'm going to say I want this one to drop and generate an event. Now, it doesn't matter what the state of that rule is from all the layers below, because I turned on that rule to drop the packet. It will supersede anything from the below layers. And here it is, that one rule. And my policy is an aggregate from all these layers going down. And again, I could have a secondary layer, or I can come in here and add a shared layer that comes from a different policy, right? When you're importing shared layers, know that they are in read mode only. You can't modify them. You can only modify layers that are configured within this policy. But I really don't need to import this as a shared layer because it is my base layer that I'm using for this intrusion policy. Let me go in here and commit my changes and say this is the second Friday Firepower Hour demo IPS policy. Commit this, and we are good to go. Now, as this is saving this intrusion policy, I'm going to quickly recap. So we went through the 3 different layers from the intrusion policies that we get from Cisco. We looked at the what's the criteria to turn on the different rules within these policies. We looked at rule actions. We've looked at the network discovery in order that we can turn on Firepower recommendations. We looked at network analysis policies. We looked at shared IPS policy layers, as well as sharing some best practices ideas, meaning you create a policy, use that as your base policy layer in subsequent intrusion policies. The advantage is I can go to that intrusion policy, the original one, make changes, and the changes will reflect and be consistent across all the policies that use that as the base layer. With that, it's the top of the hour. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there's any questions that anyone might have. In any case, certainly appreciate everyone's time being here. Anything that's pending from a question perspective?
So we had Greg, I think, was going to ask a question. Greg, are you still in need of an answer there? Yeah, Paul, looks like we got one from Craig Lindsay. I don't know off the top of my head. Can you negate an IP address in the networks to examine section instead of being inclusive?
You sure can. So it's an exclamation point. So if you put an exclamation point in front of the IP, you can certainly negate that. So it's just like, it's no different than a variable set. So an exclamation point is a negation. And you can actually use that in a snort rule.
Yeah, and the question, that's how it started off, and then the question said, well, and it sounds like there may be ASA with Firepower, where you could also block it on the ASA, just say, just do it on part of an ACL if you wanted to.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So either place you could do it.
Absolutely. And to your point, Jim, I would do it further out, right? So if you can do it at a router or firewall before the IPS, you'll definitely improve performance.
Yep.
Good call. Any other questions before we stop the recording? Scott, feel free to stop the recording. Everyone, have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Appreciate you all being here. Scott, Jim, Ryan, as always, guys, really appreciate your support. And for everyone, the recording will be posted shortly to